a very exciting time for museums at the University of Michigan. In March, we reopened this magnificent reimagined museum. This coming Sunday, the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology is opening a beautiful new addition that is providing greatly expanded exhibition and storage spaces. This fall, we launched a new undergraduate minor in museum studies to accompany our already thriving graduate program. These events provided an impetus to organize a LSA Theme Semester dedicated to exploring the past, present, and future roles that museums play in the academy. A marvelous array of special exhibitions, courses, lectures, and workshops have been planned. Initially, we were thinking of this as a theme semester, but the response from students, faculty, and staff has been so great that we are now dedicating the entire year to celebrating our rich museum and collections-based resources, but also thinking about the significance of museums in today's universities. The theme semester is giving us an opportunity to articulate to the university community as well as its constituents why museums are important, why they matter. This evening, 3 of the country's leading directors of university art museums will explore the question, what is special about university art museums? Let me take a few moments to briefly introduce our guests. Thomas Lenz is the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museum. He oversees one of the leading arts institutions in the United States with a collection of more than 260,000 objects and a staff of over 260. A 1985 graduate of Harvard's doctoral program in art history, Tom Lenz is a specialist in Persian painting. After serving as curator of Asian art at the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design, he moved to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where he headed the Department of Ancient and Islamic Art. He returned to the East Coast in 1992 to the Smithsonian, initially as head of research and collections at the Freer Gallery of Art and Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, later becoming deputy director, and then moving to an appointment as director of the Smithsonian's International Art Museums Division in 2000. He came to Harvard in mid-November 2003. Lawrence Rinder is director of the University of California, Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. He has held positions at the Museum of Modern Art, Walker Art Center, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, where he was chief curator of the 2002 biennial. Among the other exhibitions he has organized are In a Different Light, Bitstreams, The American Effect, and Tim Hawkinson. He was the founding director of the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts at California College of Arts in San Francisco, where he also served as dean. His writing on art has appeared in Art Forum, Flash Art, Nest, The Village Voice, Philip, and Atlantica. Art Life, a collection of his essays, was published by Gregory R. Miller in 2005. He has also published poetry, fiction, and a play co-authored with Kevin Killian. James Stewart is currently director of the Princeton University Museum of Art. As most of you are aware, from 1998 until just a few months ago, James served as director of UMA, where he led the development of a major expansion and rethinking of the museum. Prior to coming to Michigan, James Stewart was chief curator of the University of California, Berkeley Art Museum. He holds the doctorate of philosophy in the history of art from Trinity College, Oxford University, where he studied with Francis Haskell. He has edited or authored a number of books, including The New Child, British Art and the Origins of Modern Childhood, 1730 to 1830. The collections of the Romanovs, European Art from the State Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg. When Time Began to Rant and Rage, Figurative Painting from 20th Century Ireland. And The Mask of Venice, Masking Theater and Identity in the Art of Tiepolo and His Times. Each of these publications were associated with major exhibitions. The current economic crisis has prompted the closure of museums on a number of university campuses. The most celebrated case has been the Rose Museum of Art at Brandeis University, where not only was the museum closed, but there was serious talk of selling its art collections. We might believe ourselves immune to such actions here at the University of Michigan, or at Harvard, UC Berkeley, or Princeton. But are we? How relevant are our art museums to the core mission of the university? What role should art museums play in a university context in shaping tomorrow's citizens and leaders? Is there something that an art museum offers that cannot be found elsewhere in the academy? One could argue that art museums in the academy have been and continue to be marginalized, to exist at the periphery of what goes on university campuses. Why is this the case? Considering the role that university art museums play on campuses across the nation, as well as in larger communities in which they reside, what can and should a university of art museum do that a civic museum cannot? We have asked these three gentlemen this evening to engage in a conversation that explores these and other issues. Following their conversation, we'll save some time for the audience to pose questions or offer responses to these issues. Let me start things off by posing the last question I mentioned just a moment ago. What is the difference between a civic and university-based art museum? What can and should a university art museum do that a civic art museum cannot?
Thank you. You're the guest of honor. I think you should get out of the gate first.
Well, I was actually thinking the opposite because I know by face recognition, so many people in the audience have heard me say this before. But sure. Yeah, I have made the argument about difference that a lot of this stems from the core mission of what a great university is, and that is, among other things, a kind of spawning ground for new ideas, for experimentation, for risk-taking. I would argue that those are things that we in academic museums not only can do, but must do, in part because of the peril that many of our civic museums have experienced for far longer than the current economically challenged period. Because indeed, for arguably, 30 years, gait has become so much more present as a driving factor for the great civic museums. And that we, as I've said, have not only the possibility, but the obligation of doing things that push the envelope, that suggest the necessity of fostering new research or of challenging people to think freshly about the art of the present or the past. To me, that's at the core. Another aspect from my perspective would be, as indeed we've attempted to embody in this building, that by virtue of situating ourselves in an inherently multidisciplinary environment, meaning the work that's done around our museums, we have an obligation to engage in multifaceted directions and to try to position, in some of our cases I know, an art museum as a meeting ground where different ideas and different perspectives are played out.
So to be devil's advocate for just a moment, almost all the things that you've described as being the purview of the academic museum, probably the director of any civic museum would say those are the same things they want to do. And any museum anyway that has a modern contemporary program would say they want to be risk-taking and excellent and all of those things, and engaged with learning and so on. And indeed, I think since the 1960s at least, many civic institutions, even places like the Metropolitan, have broken new ground in methodologies of exhibition practice that don't look anything like the traditional form of exhibition making. So is there really something that differentiates us? I mean, we do engage with faculty more than a civic museum does. But beyond that, in terms of our daily work, are our exhibitions fundamentally different from a civic museum?
You really are the devil's advocate, I do think that, there are things we do differently. You've alluded to this already. We're not driven by the gate. We're not driven by revenue generation. For example, at Harvard, what they're interested in is this: what kind of teaching and learning experiences can you create for students and faculty? And that's where I think our ultimate path lays. We have diplomatically, persistently tried to generate the argument at Harvard that we can teach in ways through the collection, through object-based teaching and research, we can teach in ways that the rest of the university cannot. And that may seem rather self-evident, and maybe it's just part of Harvard's Anglo-Puritan origins, but the visual arts have always been sort of held at arm's length. In fact, we hear consistently at Harvard that if it's not a text, if it's not a number, it's somehow considered suspect as knowledge or information. In fact, the curators are always talking to me about the alphanumeric bias. So our goal ultimately, and I think it's ultimately the goal of all university art museums, is what can you add to and how can you align to the university's educational mission? Because I do think we have that ability to teach differently.
Yeah, I agree, and just to give some measure to this observation that we're not as driven by the gate or attendance, the portion of our budget that is attendance is about 4 or 5% compared to SF MoMA is about 20 or 30%. I'm not sure we take as much advantage of that as we might. I mean, the fact that we don't actually have to, the pleasure of our audience in some respect isn't driving our bottom line. I think we could probably do a lot more risk-taking than we do, actually. So I'll go back home and risk-take. I came from my job immediately prior to coming back to Berkeley was as dean at the California College of the Arts. So I spent 4 years as an academic administrator. And it was an education. I learned how to talk like an academic administrator, and I know what a learning outcome is and all of these sort of strange things. But some of the information that I absorbed there was very illuminating for me in terms of potential directions for university museum engagement with core curricular concerns, particularly around undergraduate education. One study that was very impressive to me was this research done by Pasquarella and Terenzini, who published a book called How College Affects Students. And it's a compilation of 2 decades of research on the various factors that actually affect student learning, and certain things that we expect would affect student learning turn out that they have no impact whatsoever, and other things have surprisingly strong effect. So I'm looking through this book, and this is in my position as dean, and I'm thinking, how am I going to make this a better, more successful college? And I'm seeing the things that sort of rise up as among the most important factors. Student, peer engagement, encounters with diversity, ideas that challenge the sense of self, the established sense of self, encounters with what are wonderfully called wicked problems. I think that's the technical term for them, problems that don't have an immediately evident solution. And I'm thinking to myself, if I were university president, I would realize that all of those things are located in the museum.
Exactly.
You don't have to create them in the dormitory. You don't have to run out and start a new program someplace to create these things that are going to support learning. They're already in the museum. And I think that there's a tremendously important frontier that we can begin to explore on the level of undergraduate learning by first of all, framing so that people can recognize that those factors are present in the university and the museum environment, and then fostering them and assessing, in fact, their impact on university learning across the board, not just obviously in the arts, but across the board. So that's one of the things we're taking baby steps towards working on at the museum. And I think in terms of how are we different from a a civic museum in this respect. Well, we're different because we have this captive audience that we can do this with, but ultimately, whatever we learn from this will be equally supportive of everyone's experience, because of course everyone is learning, not just undergraduates.
Part of, to me, what is different in that fundamental capacity, since you invoke, the term captive audience, is that our captive audience is here typically for rather a long time. They're not here for a one-week study break. Undergraduate life, 4 years on average, maybe more. Some places, graduate life anywhere between, 6 years and infinity. There is a possibility of a certain kind of sustained engagement, which is not, I think, typical of non-university museums.
Right.
One of my goals has been to not only bring students in, but to bring them back again and again, so that they're having an additive or a kind of cumulative experience.
Right. And one that's accessible, because they're there for a long time. I mean, they're not a visitor who comes and then goes back to whatever city they came from.
And I think I'm right. You charge an admission for non-students?
We do.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And Michigan
So do we.
and Princeton are actually both free to everybody. And to me, of course, there are increasing numbers of civic museums that are going down that road as well. But one of the great advantages of doing that, of course, particularly for students, is that we can, I think, enable different kinds of museum-going behaviors. You don't have to get your money's worth, because your money's worth has been achieved the minute you walk in the door. You can go to simply revisit your favorite single object. Although I know there's a debate around this whole point.
Yeah. Well, James, you may recall when we were both at Berkeley, one of our trustees had the great idea, because our attendance was very low, that we would pay students to come to the museum.
I'd like the details on that plan. Yeah. But, in terms of student engagement, I'm just curious, what role does faculty play in this, say, here at Michigan, at Berkeley? I know what role it plays at Harvard, but I'm curious to hear what you say.
No.
I have to step through that gate first. It's interesting, in earlier discussions today we were talking about this. It's a curious balance for us at Harvard, because the museum until about 1990 was actually run entirely by the faculty. The director was always a member of the art history faculty. The curators were always full-time faculty members. And for a variety of reasons, that essentially drove the museum into the ground. It was not a workable model. And in 1990, they essentially separated. Let me explain what I mean by that statement. I think there were enormous benefits that occurred because of faculty involvement. It's how the museum began. It's how the collections were developed and grown and refined. But I'd say over the last 20 or 30 years, art museums in this country have turned into very different entities. They're far more complex. They have far more demands on their time, many different constituencies to speak to. And as I was saying this afternoon, the notion that a full-time art history professor with his classes, his lecturing, his research, his writing, his students, is going to essentially run another full-time job is not tenable, I don't think, anymore. So today, we have, well, I'll say it, we have what we consider to be a fully professional staff. We no longer have any faculty members who sit in curatorial positions in the museum. Now, having said that, we also have very close relations with the art history faculty. We serve many audiences, but in many ways, they're first among equals for us. But our balance in this new model, which we think works well, is how do we run the museum and at the same time maintain our ability to be an independent site of research and scholarship. Our danger in working with the faculty, that didn't come out quite the right way, but what we have to be on guard for is not simply turning into a kind of service center for faculty. We're much more than a clerical staff. We have a number of curators who could be faculty members, and as they tell me repeatedly, I could have been a faculty member, but I wanted to be a curator because I can do different things as a curator. So for us, it's an ongoing process and dialogue, because we're there in large part to serve the faculty, and faculty in large part engage students with the museum. So it's something we work on continually.
Well, I'll give a two-part answer, one based on my experience here, and then one some of my early phase perceptions at Princeton. Here, I think a substantial part of our effort in recent years, including, again, some things that helped to inform the design of this building, was to not only serve in a kind of core level the history of art department effectively in a variety of ways, curricular and I would say co-curricular too, but to open that out to engage a far wider number of disciplines who might never really have thought about the art museum as a visual equivalent to the library, meaning as a true campus-wide resource that could be used actively in teaching. And so, the education staff here for years now has run everything from regular faculty workshops to help not only new faculty, but faculty who've been around for a while to think about what are the other ways in which one might think about working with an art museum, distinct from simply maybe, once in a million years I'd come in and guest curate an exhibition. But how could I actively use this in my weekly classroom teaching? And that certainly encompassed a whole range of faculty, including in what probably 10 years ago would have been unexpected quarters of looking to the life sciences or to medicine, for example. Interestingly, some of the challenges I'm seeing at Princeton are very similar. I think the relationship there between museum and department is, I will say this, punning, very close. We actually continue to share a building. There are 3 tenants under one very large roof: department, fine arts library, and art museum. Functionally, we split something like 80 years ago. But the decision has been made to retain this kind of physical immediacy. The challenge, among others, is there's been almost no work done to really open that out to others. And so there is at times a kind of sense of narrowness of purpose when our curators are thinking about the reasons to make a particular acquisition or the ways of programming a particular exhibition. It kind of resonates not only first, but perhaps only on the level of, will that one faculty member use this show? And I'm bringing the argument that that's not good enough. They may need to start there, but it has to ripple out, or, and this is where I would go back to the point that Ray made about the Rose Museum at Brandeis. The risk, I think, is that we end up being perhaps vital, but to too small a subset of the larger institutional framework. With all empathy for Brandeis's situation, I have to believe on some level that decision their trustees made was possible because they didn't know that there would be faculty from across the campus rising up in arms to say, you cannot do that.
Yeah.
And of course, it looks like that's rather what happened. Those who rose up in anger were their most immediate faculty in art and those who had donated to the museum. The others on faculty don't, so far as I can perceive, seem to have felt as imperiled that something essential to their work as faculty, to their reason for being at a place like Brandeis, would be lost if the art museum didn't continue to exist.
Yeah, I think we as university museum directors have a tremendous amount of work to do, and it's work we have to do very quickly to not only prove, but really embrace and demonstrate our relevance and our significance to the core, learning mission of the university. I think it's really absolutely important. And I do think in the ways that you've described, we need to go beyond the kinds of services that frankly are still important, of being available for the esoteric scholar who wants to see the, the Mughal, miniatures and do their thing. You have to do that, but then you have to find ways in which the art to engage a much broader population in the ways that art is relevant to any sort of education. Another piece of this that I'm hoping to explore at the museum, and I think a place where museums can function strategically, and again, I'm sort of putting my dean's hat back on and thinking if I was an academic dean at Berkeley, how would I instrumentally use the museum? And I think a very interesting way to engage with museum staff is to give them resources, to allow them to, or to inspire them to, experiment with alternative pedagogical strategies. There's a lot of new research into learning that suggests that the students learn best in non-traditional pedagogical methodologies, that sitting in a classroom and having someone lecture to you is not really the best way to learn. There's all these ideas about engaged learning and so on. It's probably not news to many of you people here. But changing the way faculty actually teach, I mean, having been a dean, I know it is not an easy thing to say, look, here's the research. It says if you do it this way, your students will learn better. Well, I've always been doing it this way, or the research is wrong, or oh, to hell with all of you, And what I think museums can do is model some of those alternative practices through the way that we approach education. Whether we have to go to the extent of really, assessing the results in a way that can, yet again, prove their effectiveness, perhaps we have to do that. And maybe the best way to do that is in aggregate, and we should form a consortium that does this, because a single institution, a single program won't be, statistically relevant. But I do think that if we can show through practice, demonstrate through the work that we actually do, that there are different ways to educate people, and that art just happens to be the vehicle, that we will have some relevance within the university.
We've actually done a little bit of work on that at Harvard. We're in the middle of at the beginning of a big renovation expansion project at the Art Museum. And one of our priorities is to put in place that kind of different mode of learning with our collection. We actually conducted a study with the Graduate School of Education at Harvard on our study centers. I know that you have study centers here. They've been a part of our history as well. It kept bubbling to the top of the pile in all of our planning about the future of the museum. And we finally said, let's take this idea, take it to the Graduate School of Education, and have them tell us, how does a study center differ from other types of learning? How is it different as a viewing experience? They studied the problem for about a year with our participation and the participation of a lot of students and faculty. And what they did is they came back to us with a report, and as they said, cutting to the chase, they said, what happens in a study center is, in our view, the gold standard for learning. It is what we call high-end cognition. It is self-directed, it is less mediated, it is more participatory. So that was, needless to say, music to our ears. It also happens to dovetail very neatly with the new general education and curriculum at Harvard, which of course in true academic fashion was debated for about 15 years before it was finally installed. But I won't go into the details of the new general education curriculum, but this loops back to what you were saying. It's broken into 8 areas. In every one of those areas, you read it and you go, this is where the art museum can be an arena. This is where the art museum can be a different kind of classroom, a different site for learning. So Those things are very much in the air. I know not just at Harvard, but on all campuses right now. I'm pleased that we're getting away from the notion that somehow the visual arts within an academic context are at best a kind of extracurricular activity. I never want them to stop being an extracurricular activity, but we think universities can make far greater use of these kinds of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to go back to the study of Pasquarello and Terenzini, it really shows that learning does not, I mean, it's common sense, does not stop when you leave the classroom, and that actually the extracurricular experiences undergird effective classroom learning. Museums are, you know, just an exceptional site for organizing behaviors and activities with the slightest bit of sort of direction and encouragement in particular directions, as study centers do. Some things that come to mind that I think the current research shows are support learning are peer-to-peer engagement. So you have a study center, and I think maybe the typical engagement with a study center is someone comes in, maybe there's a relationship to an object or objects and the attendant or whoever is in the room. It wouldn't be so difficult to structure just a slightly different arrangement where people would go in pairs, for example, where students would, you know, I don't know if you'd force them to go in pairs, but you'd somehow encourage that. And simply by making that one adjustment to the rules, you would foster, I think, a more effective learning experience, and somehow monitor that, see what happens when you do that, and how that experience is different from when a person goes in alone. Those kinds of things, I think, could inform the general educational mission of the institution in a very interesting way.
And this is something that, of course, a lot of us have been doing arguably for a long time, maybe not exactly in that mode, but by creating student docenting programs where students are docenting each other, so that it is a kind of active form of learning, but much more on a peer-to-peer basis.
Right.
As perhaps, again, an extension of what they're doing in a more formal and traditional classroom setting.
You know, we like the study center model. It's going to be a big part of our future, but we're also very much aware of the fact that it's simply a different kind of experience. We're not trying to create a kind of hierarchy of visual learning and experience. We're not placing a value judgment on the benefits of one mode over the other. So in our view, walking through a gallery, that's one kind of experience. Sitting in a classroom with a teacher, that's another experience. The study center is another experience. But to have those kinds of dimensions within a museum, I think that's a pretty potent resource.
One of the issues I think that continues to inform some of our collective struggles, and we were chatting about this privately a little earlier, is the fact that we aren't perceived as being tuition-generating units of universities. You know, we don't have majors who major in the museum. They may major or minor, in the case of Michigan, in museum studies in ways that are only possible because you have museums, but those revenue streams don't essentially flow through the museum in the way that they would through departments, schools, colleges, et cetera. And I think that is something that makes us, in a way, oddities within universities and make it harder for administration folks at times to kind of understand or even visualize the model of an art museum as being other than peripheral, because we're not at that core. So how do we reposition ourselves? I don't know that we can change these funding models in the broader sense, but how do we change that understanding of museums on the part of those who are making key decisions at top levels in terms of allocating university resources in times when they're stretched thinly?
You know, it's interesting. I'm sure we've all experienced this, but even old universities with old university art museums remain sort of strange animals. They're not understood. Faculty oftentimes don't understand art museums. Someone who I think you both know, Ian Barry, who is the chief curator at the Tang Museum. I remember one time he told me, he said, it took me years to realize this working here on campus, but he said it finally dawned on me, even Nobel laureates don't like to walk into a museum and feel like an idiot because they don't know the terrain. They don't know that it's perfectly acceptable to stand in front of a painting and be confused or perplexed or irritated.
But some of that happens because we define ourselves and are seen as public goods, meaning the Nobel laureate in whatever field might still feel some compulsion to visit a museum where perhaps those of us in the humanities wouldn't feel the same compulsion to go into a genomics laboratory.
True. And I think a lot of the burden rests on our shoulders as university art museums because I don't think we do a very good job, or at least we haven't done a good job historically of reaching out to faculty. And, that's a continuing discourse.
One of the rationales for the existence of university art museums, and I think this comes out a bit in the Harvard White Paper. Is that what it's called? There was this recent paper that came out of Harvard about the importance of the arts on campus, and
right,
we
exactly.
call it the Harvard White Paper anyway. And it's sort of the Bourdieuian vision of culture, which is that culture is an important aspect of the formation of social identity and class identity, and that you're helping the students to sort of move forward to gain an essential tool in their negotiation of class status and social advancement through the acculturation. And that may well be a legitimate reason to have museums. There's no doubt that acculturation greases the skids, as it were, for a successful career in business, a successful life, and whatnot. But I think that I personally would prefer to focus on these questions about pedagogy and learning, and sort of cognitive development, as opposed to this sort of social veneer, although I think both of those things are inevitably at play when one is dealing with art in a university context. And in terms of the sort of the core issue of how do we demonstrate our relevance or our importance, our necessity to academic administrators, I don't think you can choose one or the other. I think you really have to move forward with both. At the University of California at Berkeley, something like 40% of our students are the first in their family to go to college. We have a huge population of students who are literally moving up in the world the day they walk onto that campus in terms of their the social community that they're about to participate in. Demographically in the United States, and especially in California, this is the challenge of higher education. We are facing a rising cohort of students who are coming from, through an immigrant wave of immigration and so on, and now with the economy and the way it is, this issue of how does the university negotiate the social transformation, never mind the sort of the cognitive transformation that takes place in a student as they go from a freshman to a senior, I think is something to think about. Whether to put it first and foremost is another question.
As you were speaking, Larry, I was just remembering a conversation I had recently with a Princeton alumnus who was telling me a story about how when he went to Princeton in the 1960s, he went knowing he wanted to do chemistry and naively thinking that he was going to only have to do chemistry. Somehow he missed the part of the admissions manual that said, oh, and you have distribution requirements, or whatever they called them then. And so it was literally his day standing in the queue of having to decide what bloody annoying other courses he was going to have to take. And he thought, well, okay, I'll take art history because that sounds easy. I don't know, but I don't know anything about literature either, so I'll do that. He told me he ended up taking 3 history of art courses that were largely taught through the art museum. And literally in his words, he said, "It changed my life." He went on to become a biochemist who was enormously successful in the biotech field and became an art collector and so forth. But his words were that it was his exposure to the visual arts that had fundamentally changed his life. And I understood him to mean through that, in part, that it had opened him to a sense of a wider world and an understanding of otherness that he didn't feel he would have got through any other disciplinary study.
I believe it, and this is this idea of opening to the wider world, encountering otherness, sort of absorbing it, accepting that challenge to oneself, and emerging a more complex person is, that is an essential definition of growth of cognitive and personal, emotional individuation. And I do believe in my heart that art is one of the best, if not the best, vehicle for bringing people forward in that journey. And so I'm not surprised.
Since our four, I'll include Michigan in this, museums all operate in a sense, kind of urban environments or extended urban environments. Princeton is certainly not itself an urban environment, but we have two of them on our doorstep. I'm curious what you perceive the sort of, again, maybe the additive value or the reason for, in your case, the Berkeley Museum is when there are many things that we're talking about that students could experience arguably at their doorstep in the form of our sister, peer institutions nearby.
Sure.
As at MoMA, Fine Arts Museums, Oakland in your case, or, Tom, you were talking about your work with Boston.
Yeah, we have a pretty well-developed museum ecology in Boston, whether it's the MFA or the ICA or the Gardner Museum, so it's...
So how do we argue for ourselves when you could say, well, notwithstanding what I was saying earlier about the value of the sustained engagement?
Right, well, I think, again, when you're dealing with our particular population, 40% never having gone to college, there isn't many of those same people have never been into an art museum, and so our proximity to the campus and the fact that we can, orchestrate desire to a certain extent, do some kind of thing, and when the students first come, that brings them there. It's the first thing that happens to them when they come to the campus, and get that over that hurdle right at the start. I think that is really, really key, and this is certainly something I'm going to focus on more in the years to come. I think the sooner you get students in there as freshmen, the sooner you get over that hesitation to participate in what museums are, the better things will be. There are great museums in our community, the De Young, the San Francisco Museum, they're far away. And I think all museums are far away culturally from many of our students. When you add to that the fact that they're physically far away, they're just not going to go.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, it really is about making it, in a sense, a threshold you can't avoid.
Yeah.
We can only do if you're right there.
Right. And we are, I should add here, we are lowering our threshold to the point where it's lower than the floor. What we are doing at our museum, I have taken the art out of our atrium space. You'll remember it well. And we've put in this very attractive, charismatic, interactive seating sculpture. So it is art, but you can sit on it. And I'm envisioning it as a kind of an island for students, sort of students as sea lions sort of gathered on this form. And I thought to myself, what are the things, how can I make this so that they just have to be there? So we put in wireless internet, and we put outlets on the blob, I call it the blob, so they can plug in their laptops, and we're going to serve coffee and pastries in the gallery. They will come, and they will be there. And once they're there, then anything can happen. But you have to get them in the door.
Right. That puts me in mind of a conversation I once had with a civic museum director who I won't name here. I know Ruth at least knows who I'm about to reference. But
come on.
Where this, no, we're being taped. Where this person said to me that they didn't care what their visitors experienced once they were in the door. All that mattered was that they came. And I take it absolutely the other way around. I don't care what it is that gets the students in the door the first time. Then I care very passionately
Yes,
about
I
what
agree with that.
experience they have once they're there.
Right.
If it's food or the blob or
That gets them there,
that gets someone in who doesn't yet have a comfort level of the whole idea of what a museum is,
Yeah.
or perhaps the wrong idea. I mean, I
Right.
think we're victimized to some degree by the fact that a lot of museum going experience isn't always enormously
Right.
engaging.
But for example, then, one of the things that we'll do to the unwitting sea lions is when they open their laptops, the splash page will be our splash page, and it'll say, artwork of the day, and they have to look at that before they go on to their Facebook.
So what role is technology going to play in the future of your museums?
The short answer where I am now is to say right now it plays no role. I'm the first person to
You
admit.
have electric lights at Princeton, right?
We do.
But I
We're
mean,
probably the last major museum in North America to begin digitizing its collections. It is one of the kind of shockingly behind the curve, how did that happen questions. But, I'll answer a little bit now in terms of, this place we're sitting in, that we really saw the digital, the electronic as a combination of everything from distance learning, reinforcement of experience, visibility, creating a global community, that whole collective, but it's something that also goes to a point you were speaking of earlier, and that is shaping a sense of social behaviors around art. So that upstairs, there's this thing we made called the dialogue table that is a socially interactive tool that works differently when there are multiple people engaging with it. So that it hopefully does encourage, not just among students, of course, but some level of interplay and play with some emphasis on playfulness that can be made possible only through that kind of digital platform.
Yeah.
and despite all the benefits of technology, do you worry about other roles technology can play to the detriment of, say, the actual object?
My short answer used to be no, and Ruth would know this particularly, because I used to, and in some degree I still believe this generally, but that the digital would, if we are using it correctly, create a desire for the authentic.
Deeper interest, yeah.
My growing concern is that people much younger than we have no experience of a world in which this hasn't been an integral function. And therefore, they may not see any differentiation between the two. Authentic experience is digital experience. And so that hunger may not be being created. The idea that there's a distance between the digital and the hand of the artist is at risk of being lost. And the other particular worry I'm finding more and more I'm having is about the whole business of attention span. I've joked for years about museum-going habits in which, was it the Louvre or someone had done a study that showed, the average visitor spent 1.5 seconds on average in front of a work of art because they were moving their way so quickly through the galleries. But are our current mechanisms not, in a sense, encouraging that kind of constant browsing mentality, as opposed to the thing that says, I not only can stop, I need to stop and look really closely and have an intimate engagement with this thing in front of me that isn't necessarily a moving image.
I mentioned this study center report that we did with the Graduate School of Education, and they cited statistics similar to those that you just mentioned. What we found with the study center experience was that in the galleries, people spent on average 2 minutes with an object. In the study center, 43 minutes. Now that will differ, from person to person, but one of the things that we don't like about technology is, well, some of the things you just alluded to. I hear this repeatedly from curators and from faculty members that students, when they actually get in front of an object, are oftentimes completely surprised and thrown off balance by simple things like scale, materiality, things that don't come through necessarily through digital means. So for us at least, maybe we're a little bit simple-minded this way, but we never want to lose that connection with the object.
And you need an iPhone to tell them, look at the scale, notice the texture.
The electric shocks do that, yeah.
Well, there was a column in something called Inside Higher Ed last week, written by the former dean of arts and sciences at Northwestern, who said a lot of things I disagreed with. But one of them was he was making the argument that university art museums don't need to own art objects anymore. In part because of digital access, that the world is your oyster now.
It's a very easy,
in terms of getting at the image. And if you really still value the idea of putting the student in front of the actual object at full scale and texture and so forth, well, then give them a travel grant and let them travel, because that will be less costly than your stewardship obligations for caring for a collection of X or Y or Z size.
No, we've been horribly wrong about everything, apparently. Yeah.
Well, I have to believe that sort of the kinesthetic, directly, let's use that word directly, sort of visual, even oral responses that one has in a physical space with objects and things that one can have in a museum has got to be a piece of this undergirding of learning, that the encounter with not only the difficult idea, but the difficult sensation is a learning experience, a cognitively, strengthening experience. And art does that as well. Certainly we encounter complex spaces and forms all the time, but when you walk up in front of a really great Donald Judd for the first time and you wonder, is it really as simple as it looks, and ponder that for a while, I've got to believe that that is doing something to your brain that is healthy and useful. And and it doesn't have to be a minimalist work of art. I mean, there are tricks of composition and visuality in art throughout the ages that I think stimulate the mind in ways that are fundamentally instructive and good. So I'm all for it.
One of the things we battle against is this enduring notion in an academic context that works of art are simply pretty things. And one of the arguments we've been trying to make at Harvard is that, yes, they oftentimes are very beautiful things, but if you look a little bit differently at works of art as the material, physical embodiment of ideas and values and traditions and emotions and attitudes, then all of a sudden works of art turn into something very different, even from an academic perspective. So ultimately, I think if we can help universities in this kind of thinking, we can unleash this universe of ideas that are embedded in collections, and that's our great resource. And I occasionally am dismayed when I hear universities always make the quick, easy analogy between a university art museum and the library. I think there are a lot of commonalities, but ultimately we're quite different. The material's different, we use it differently.
So, if one can draw a kind of a straight line or a continuum between texts in the library and objects and say they're all meaningful things, in sort of a semiotic sense, but there are those things that artworks do differently than texts and other kinds of cultural artifacts. And some of those things are very difficult to place within an academic framework because they have to do with emotion and psychology and things that are uncontainable and almost, if you see them, can feel a little dangerous even.
That's part of the problem with art in a university context. It doesn't fit into neat, tidy packages. As you said, it can get messy very quickly.
And I mean, in a sense, we too, I think, are wanting to kind of play it both ways, because as you were saying earlier about, the challenges of being in a data and logo-centric locale, some of our ammunition is we turn around to someone who comes in perhaps with a certain set of biases about that and say, oh, well, but you can treat our art objects like texts. You can read them as texts. Well, then we're perpetuating that idea that they are the same when they may have certain similarities, but still fundamental differences too. And of course, I mean, for me, one of the issues is it ought to be unsettling. And that too, by the way, I mean, notwithstanding what many civic museums like to say about themselves, I see a huge divide between what many museums say about themselves and then what they actually do. At the hint of controversy, they run the other direction unless they perceive the controversy is going to help sell tickets. But that really the idea of showing something that's difficult, even if not shocking, but maybe difficult because it's not fashionable. Mm-hmm. God forbid we be Luddites and show something that isn't in the current taste. And I think, again, we may have a greater capacity to do that than would a civic museum that may be more ultimately comfortable about sustaining the comfort levels of visitors rather than lending to a discomfort.
Although it's a tricky argument. I mean, going back to what Larry said earlier, we like to think that what really distinguishes us is our research and teaching mission. But as you said, I look at museums like MoMA or the Met, some of the exhibition and research projects they've put together in recent years. I'd be hard-pressed to think of a university art museum that could match that kind of effort. I mean, part of it is the kinds of resources they can bring to bear, but that wouldn't happen without the will being there to do it. So we, in many ways, I think, do occupy kind of a contested landscape now, and in some ways, I think we kind of like having it both ways. Even in terms of the public, I think all of us serve the same function. We're technically university art museums, but in reality, we're kind of hybrids because, for example, at Harvard, we're one of the beneficial faces of the university in terms of the local community. As people keep reminding me, we're one of the few buildings on the Harvard campus you can get into without a Harvard ID.
Which, on the other hand, I mean, that certainly can play to your advantage.
Yeah.
I'm making the argument at Princeton.
Oh, we're exploiting it.
That, that this is a plus because there are massive numbers of tourists, blessedly, who come to Princeton. We've discovered that not a lot of them come into the art museum in part because they've struggled to find their way there because historically the campus has refused all signage and all wayfinding. So I literally stand in front of the art museum. I know.
How does that work?
It's working great. And one of the questions that was asked of me, even when I was exploring the possibility of going there, and I said, well, it does seem that you're doing your best to keep people from finding you, including students. And I was assured that we could begin to shift this, but the university is in fact embracing the idea that in order to help tourists and other visitors have a fuller sense of a visit to Princeton, that to become part of Princeton for a couple of hours, they're going to get that best by coming to the art museum and then simply strolling the campus, because there's almost nothing else they either can go into or arguably would want to,
right,
because they won't see anything happening there. They can't go into the classrooms necessarily, so.
Yeah, for us, there's an additional factor here. In being a public university, a publicly funded university, there is a even stronger mandate to give back some of that wealth to the community. And the university, of course, can't make every laboratory and classroom open to everyone, but it has to find increasingly ways to make as much as possible accessible. And the museum is one of the best ways to do that. And I think our new site in downtown Berkeley will be a godsend for the university as a whole, and saying, okay, look, here's our firstborn, raise him well.
Yeah, it's funny. University art museums are oftentimes orphans within their own home, but when it comes to community relations strategies, we're front and center. We're the first thing pushed out there.
I literally had arrived at Princeton, which was in the middle of a rather badly stage-managed attempt to sell the broader population on a new arts district that's been in the planning that was launched without a real kind of ability to understand that there was going to be opposition to it, in part because it involved some governmental oddities. And the first thing they said to me was, you know, people love the art museum, so we're going to send you out on the road as the spokesperson for this other project.
Here's your flak jacket.
Right,
Yeah.
because it will go down better if you're doing that speaking. It was an interesting kind of discovery. I mean, I'm still, you know, affectionate about a moment here when I came to Michigan, when absolutely, again, as a public university, there was a very strong prevailing view that the art museum not only needed to play that role of, in a sense, helping to make very clear that a great public university deserves the public trust and deserves the public investment, but when the then provost at Michigan, Nancy Cantor, said that her hope was that the art museum could over time be seen as a kind of analogy to the football stadium, without overdrawing the parallel, of course, but with the idea that it would be the same kind of available gateway, and arguably more available because there wasn't a 10-year waiting list for season tickets.
Yeah, no, it's true.
A question about new technological initiatives, and basically, how do you evaluate their effect? This is one of my big problems because as a professor, I'm beginning to podcast, use various collaborative websites for my students, things like that. Some of it's very easy to see how it changes things in the classroom, but when you're putting information out there, I have no idea where it goes and whether it connects with anything or it just kind of drifts off into the ether. So do you have strategies dealing with evaluating the effects of your new technological ways of reaching the people?
You know, in general, I think you've touched on a sore point for all museums, and I think most museums, whether they're civic museums or university art museums, despite oftentimes saying the opposite, in reality, oftentimes we know very little about our audiences, what they like, what they dislike, and I think we're all struggling to gather that information and quantify it in some way. We were talking earlier today about certain technological issues, and certainly at my advanced age, when I say that it's a good idea and I like it, I'm now beginning to catch myself saying that if I like it, how does a student feel about it? I'm probably out of sync already.
So always do the opposite of what you want to do.
Yeah, I know.
I keep having to remind, yes, those I work with, that I'm not the focus group. I'm not the test market, because if it works for me, it probably isn't the right thing. But some of the short answer is, I mean, you use the same technology to do survey work and actually ask people after they've used an interactive program that you make available, via your webpage, to then take a few minutes to complete a questionnaire that says, how did you use this? Or what did you think? Did it work this way, this way, this way? And
yeah, I think feedback mechanisms are key. Also, having metrics at the outset is very, very important. Having some sense, even if you change your mind later on, about what is success going to look like. Why the hell are you doing these things? I mean, I have to say we're guilty in some respect of rushing headlong into the blogosphere ourselves without maybe as clear metrics as we ought to have. But we'll have them eventually. We have one of these bi-monthly newsletters that many museums have, and I have had some questions about its effectiveness and whether it's doing exactly what it ought to be doing. So we did an audience survey we sent out electronically to our membership who received this publication for free. And it came back, some of the questions had to do with the possibility of shifting some of the content into digital format onto the website and so on. The responses were invariably, or almost invariably, negative about that. Everyone loved their handheld, object thing. They wanted to read it. The people said things like, "I keep every copy that you've ever made," and and then I looked, where it said, age of respondents. Half of them were over 55. Half of them over 55. I thought, we're a university art museum, and this is our membership, and we have to be really careful about sometimes listening to the answers of our own surveys, because as much as I cherish those people who are keeping each and every copy of our monthly publication, we have to shift into a territory and into delivery mechanisms that are more available to and familiar to our student population, and that is going to be painful for some people, both inside and outside of the institution. There's no doubt in my mind that we have to do it.
And of course,
that I would make about that, though, is you don't necessarily give up the print tool.
No,
You've then got to challenge yourselves to do multiple things,
Right.
to have multiple
Right.
delivery mechanisms, just as I would say about, interpretive programming. You don't do one thing, you layer them in order to speak to a range of constituencies. As we were just saying, since all of our museums do represent both university assets and public assets, we can't entirely, skew one way or the other. I did the very same. I just launched such a newsletter at Princeton, and our students even told us that they wanted the print tool because they wanted the sheer physical mobility of the thing, the no wait for a download, the I don't have a
Carry
good
it
cell
with them.
reception, so I can't load it onto my iPhone.
Right.
It was really interesting.
Well, the thing that was really the most damning about this thing is that they rated the director's letter the lowest of all of the content.
even I don't read it, yeah. But, the question Matt raised is even more pertinent for us, people like Larry and I, who are at the beginning of building projects, and I know you dealt with it as well, but the ground literally shifts under our feet as we talk about this topic right now. And, we're talking about smart classrooms, smart galleries. Well, what does that mean 5 years from now? 5 years after we've made the decision, this is what it's going to be. And
We, here at Michigan made a decision at a certain point in the building project not to deliver a kind of handheld device in the galleries at the time the building opened, because all of our sources were telling us that the kind of combination hardware-software was shifting so quickly that what we would be delivering would theoretically be obsolete by the time the building opened. And we wanted to build on a platform that was at least going to still be functional down the road.
I've been a student employee here since 2005, and I would never have considered working in a museum as a career if I had never come in through the back door as part of the undergraduate research program. I thought I was going to be a Japanese translator, and now I would just love to live here for the rest of my life. I love it here. This is the greatest job I've ever had. But anyway.
By the way, I'm going to interrupt you long enough to say you were one of the few people I could regularly count on to be in the office later than I was.
I just wanted to move in. That's all I wanted to do, but they wouldn't let me. Anyway, my question is on digitization, considering that my degree eventually will be in preservation. I heard a lot of comments on access and digitization, particularly with your collection, James, but I know that, have your collections been digitized as well?
not entirely.
Not entirely.
We are, to the extent that anybody can be 100% digitized.
Exactly. Have you considered digitization as part of a preservation program or strictly for access?
Both. We have a number of sort of records management issues. We have the Art Museum archives. We have an archaeological excavation in Turkey that we're responsible for as well. Our collection records, curatorial records. I'd say yes, preservation is a big part of it. We have a growing awareness of the preservation aspect, but if I'm really honest, it's more access than anything. We spent about 7 years and a lot of money horsewhipping the curators to get this done. And one of the motivators we had to use with the curatorial staff was to let them know that it is indefensible within a university context to not have the collection accessible digitally to students and faculty. If that wasn't the case, it would undercut all of our arguments about our utility and value on the campus.
So do you digitize twice, or do you use one standard and re-render it to a different bit rate, or to a different file type.
She's way beyond me already. Yeah. We have a fairly large IT department. We have about 10 people in that IT department. They're continually grappling with this.
Okay.
So in other words, I'm wiggling out of that question.
All right, thanks.
I will actually say one thing about that because, not surprisingly, perhaps based on what I said, we are launching a full-scale digitization project even as we speak, and we happily have funding, and we're going to do it in a 3-year period. But we've been grappling with just those issues, ranging from, there are works of art that for us it really is as equally a preservation issue. Maybe it's something that's unexhibitable, because to exhibit it would be to destroy it, or there's inherent vice in the work, and we know it's degrading as we speak, and that we need to capture how it looks today. But that's informing choices about the way in which we're doing everything from the photography, if it's photography, of the object, in order to achieve multiple standards that would speak to publication standards, arguably kind of display standards for something where the original, for some reason, can't be shown. Glass plate negatives, notwithstanding the few that are beautifully used upstairs, are fraught because you can't routinely display them because you will degrade them in doing that.
You know, I'm sorry, I think I partly misunderstood your question. That is part of what we're doing. In fact, we have the oldest art museum conservation laboratory in the United States, and in the process of our move to a second facility to get this construction project underway, we're now being forced to deal with tens of thousands of photographs, glass plate negatives, a lot of things, frankly, that we had forgotten about. And it turns into not just a financial issue for us, but also an ethical and intellectual issue. And despite the fact that financially right now we are in extremis, we've bitten the bullet, and we are not throwing that material out, which I know some museums have done, but we're documenting it digitally. And in some cases, we document it digitally, and we save the original. We keep it in storage. And we're in the middle of a big Rothko project right now, the Harvard murals, which have normally been considered outside of the corpus because they faded. We now have a research project underway with Carol Mancusi and Garo, and a big part of that research project is going back to old film and old photographs of those murals, and they have revealed a lot of information that would be difficult to move forward without. So I'm sorry I misunderstood your question.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Are you done? Okay.
Mine was very simple. When you talk about study centers, I wonder if you'd elaborate what that is. I'm not sure I understand what that is.
I'll take the first crack at it. A study center is not a new or a radical space or experience. I think many civic museums have something generally like it. They're normally called print rooms, and they're normally off the main ceremonial pathway of a museum. In many ways, they're simply physical spaces, physical arenas where, under close supervision, in our case, students, faculty, classes, members of the public can come and actually request works of art. In other words, you can say, I'd like to look at your Dürer drawings, and I'd like to compare them with what was going on in, this will be a bad example, but what was going on in terms of ceramic decoration in Japan in the 15th century. Bad example, as I said. But in our view, these are places, and we've had them as part of the Art Museum at Harvard for a long, long time. In many ways, it's a kind of hallmark of the institution. It's a place where you have close, intimate interactions with works of art. And in our view, they're places where you look a little bit differently and you look a little bit more deeply. And what we're trying to do with our study centers is, today our study centers are primarily paper-based. The model we're moving toward is that they will be multimedia. They will be all appropriately scaled objects, so you can look at painting, sculpture, decorative arts, if it fits within the confines of that space. And obviously, these study centers, which are going to be a central part of our museum, they also force us to move toward different operational and security protocols, which has caused a lot of wringing of hands among many of the staff. Partly because we have to impose new rules, new security procedures, and I think a lot of this stems from the fact that people tend to look back to the old study centers and they think they were ideal. In reality, they were sieves in terms of security. So we have to be very careful about how these actually function in the future. So as I said, we like this kind of mix of exhibition galleries, classrooms, seminar rooms, lecture hall, and the study centers.
And how will you staff the study centers, with junior curators, or who will be in situ?
It will be a combination of collections management personnel and curatorial staff, especially junior curators, especially at the assistant curator level. Another one of our hallmarks is that we have always had a large training function at the Harvard Art Museum. So our view is this is extraordinary experience. You get to work with good faculty, good curators, a very good collection, and you work with students, faculty, and the public.
You will now presumably understand you have two of them here in the form of a study room more or less across the hall for works on paper, and then one next to it for three-dimensional objects. I would add to that, I conceptually think of open storage galleries as somewhere hovering in between the two, in the sense that you may not have the same intimacy of experience. You can't, well, maybe never do it, or have a student do it, but someone in a study center can lift the print up and show you the other side, so you can see the collector's stamps and understand something about the life of the object. But it's the next best thing, because you can have immediate visual access to a wide array of related or arguably unrelated material.
I think it's interesting here that you have both open storage in what I think is it's a sort of doable scale. And you have study centers. I've been in a lot of museums. Well, a lot of museums recently have instituted very large, very expansive open storage areas. And to my mind, it's a little bit like looking at coin displays in museums. After a while, the eye tends to blur everything together. On the other hand, there are great advantages to that, especially for researchers and for people who are serious lookers. It's pretty hard to encompass all of that in one fell swoop, like an open storage area.
And I think, again, the argument in part is you do it because you'll never have a staffing capacity that would allow you to provide that same level of access to every researcher if they had to come in and do it under supervision. In open storage, they can come in and do it without attendance.
On the other hand, this is interesting. We have a big collection. It's about 260,000 objects. The vast majority of it is light sensitive in nature. Prints, photographs, drawings, Chinese, Japanese, Korean painting, and calligraphy. In our view, we could do a couple of things with that material. We could build miles of galleries that we would have to rotate on a regular basis, which turns into an operational and financial challenge. Or we could create another portal through the study centers where people on demand can ask for that material. So hopefully we've got it in the right balance, but as you're suggesting, there are a lot of different models.
The first thing I did actually really in arriving at Princeton was to look at what acquisitions had been made over the last 5 years. And it was a little hard to understand what the reasons were. We have 8 separate curatorial departments. They were clearly, in a sense, kind of taking the pot of money and divvying it up fair and square 8 ways. And it was a somewhat haphazard kind of matter of acquiring. Challenging, particularly for us, because we collect in a number of areas that are very fraught from a provenance point of view, and I'm surprised no one has asked about that happy topic, but we have one of the great collections of pre-Columbian antiquities, for example. Well, that's really hard to keep building unless you want to go to jail, but
Apparently, a lot of people do.
exactly. I personally would like to stay out of a Roman court if I can on another area of collecting. So I actually imposed an acquisitions moratorium over the whole of the summer and a bit longer to say, we really need to talk about what acquiring objects means in a context where we can't use the collection we have. And I mean use in more than simply display. Unfortunately, people often think use means display. But I think some of what we've just been saying would bring out, from my point of view, the study access is just about as important as the display access to, again, maybe more a university museum than another. But I can't say, that we have yet come to the answer, but what I'm arguing for is a different way of understanding the utility of an acquisition, especially a purchase, distinct from accepting a gift, in part because of the stewardship responsibilities that continuing to grow collections create. How do these need to evolve to reflect the changing teaching priorities of the institution? If no one is teaching in a particular discipline in your university, do you continue to acquire objects? I would argue theoretically yes, because we don't know where the pendulum is going to swing the next time, where we'd be seen as having committed a terrible oversight if we didn't collect in an area, even if it wasn't, again, fashionable or being taught at the moment. So I'm challenging our curators to kind of open out the discussion about what utility means. It probably isn't anymore necessarily going to be, well, that would be heavily used by that one faculty person and the 2 students who work with him or her, that it needs to optimally hit on multiple levels to really be a strategic purchase.
From my perspective, I think active collecting is one of many pulses that a museum has, and if you lose that capacity, you lose one of your vital pulses. It's just something that keeps an institution engaged with its history, with the present, and with a future in a very interesting way. I mean, we, as many university museums, have a kind of a haphazard collection which is developed in part through purchase, in larger part through gift. Many different interests and sensibilities have informed it, and I think it's really essential that the staff in any present moment and the trustees and other interested parties contribute to that history through their passion and their active engagement. And after, of course, you have a certain critical mass, the thing begins to become quite an interesting project that ranges from filling in gaps. This is the famous thing that one does with collections like these. For example, we have one of the great abstract expressionist painting collections because our museum was founded by Hans Hofmann. We have 50 Hans Hofmanns. We have a great Rothko, Frankenthaler, Pollock, Reinhardt. We do not have a Klein or a Newman. So if anyone here has one, you bring it up after the program. So Klein, Newman, Lee Krasner are people who I'm actively out there looking for, because if we can get all those gaps filled in, we will have a truly great abstract expressionist collection. So that's one of the many ways in which we have to continue to try to improve in that area.
To follow up on something you said, Larry, I make the argument that university museums, and probably all museums, really in some measure ought to be a reflection of the people who are key to that institution, whether it's curators over time or faculty or benefactors. That we shouldn't, aspire to some kind of creeping ubiquity in the character of our collections, that it's perfectly appropriate to have a singular set of strengths, and then to decide, we're not going to do those other 10 things because we'll never do them as well as someone else could.
Yeah.
Larry and I were colleagues at Berkeley for 6 years, something like. And so we sat through each other's acquisitions proposals for years. And I, recognized, Larry's a master at convincing a board of trustees who really had difficulty grasping Fluxus, for example, or conceptual art more broadly, that it was essential and highly appropriate to that institution. And that's part of the argument to me, is what's appropriate to that institution. There is no cookie cutter, or there shouldn't be, because I think it just perpetuates, among other things, eventually boring museums.
One of the first things I did when I came was, I didn't put a moratorium in place, but I did put in place a kind of collection and acquisition strategy, because our collection had grown enormously over the last couple of decades. And I spent 10 years at the Smithsonian, where they have 143 million objects in their possession. And even they have realized we can't collect everything. So one of the things our collecting strategy, acquisition strategy tried to do was what you just mentioned. We live in a kind of museum-rich environment. It doesn't make any sense for us to try to rival a collection that is already in place at the Museum of Fine Arts. Where can we find our niche? What are our individual strengths? So we're being much more rigorous now about what comes into the collection. And on that point, you talked about the many pulses that surround this activity. One of the things that I would never, ever give up in connection with acquisitions is the ability to de-accession as well. We do it carefully, we do it infrequently, but to me, that's how you shape a collection.
With the increased cost to have exhibitions in art museums, time and planning spent, do you see even greater number of collaborations in the future with the non-university art museums happening?
Yes.
Yes.
We've done a number of them. Just in the few short years I've been at Harvard, we've collaborated with the National Gallery. We're going to do one with the MCA in Chicago. Our problem right now is we don't really have a facility to share and to show works of art, but we've been very deeply involved, certainly on the research end. But it's not just university art museums and big public civic museums. I think the financial environment is, whether people like it or not, it's forcing this kind of collaboration. And you see that collaboration extending even into the question you asked, acquisitions. I can think of a number of museums in this country now that co-own works of art with other institutions.
We're actively doing that. We've done some in the
In fact,
past
the Bay
year.
Area seems to be a kind of leader in that.
Yeah, we have a lot of north-south collaboration. We recently did a very, very major collaborative project with Contemporary Art Museum in San Diego. We're doing another one with Orange County. We co-own work with San Diego. I think we may soon co-own work even with the Oakland Museum. I mean, so collaboration is definitely the wave of the future.
I mean, I hope that they tend somewhat to shift in character, so that we move away from the model that institution A does all the work and then sells it to institution B, C, and D as a kind of passive recipient touring venue, but where we sit down strategically in advance and say, what are you interested in? And you find the thing you're both interested in, and you do it from the beginning. But arguably then, when you do that, choosing your partner really well. And some of this goes back, I can't, Larry, I think you may have said this, but of kind of knowing what your intended outcomes are from the beginning. What product are you looking for, and how does that affect your choice of who you partner with? I'm in the end stage of a couple of projects that I didn't initiate, where arguably some of what's been fraught is we chose partners that aren't ultimately sustainable partnerships. We'll never partner with them again. And I don't mean simply because it went badly, although that may be true too. Having done certain projects here, some of you will have heard me joke that when the Hermitage said to me at the end of a collaboration with the Hermitage, oh, let's do this again, I smiled nicely and, shook their hand and then, went and had a stiff drink. But some of it has to do with, I think, creating partnerships that you can learn from, so that when you've done the learning, you can apply it in some way. That there's something that you're really doing better the next time around, and that suggests a certain affinity, of institutional purpose or of institutional capacity.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.